Welcome to our first chapter discussion for Shadow of Night. We took a little bit of a break and we are back and ready to discuss the middle book of the All Souls trilogy.
Hooray! We're going to the past.
We're in the past. We are emphatically, thoroughly in the past. And this is as good a time as any to talk a little bit about Shadow of Night as a book, as a middle book in the series, and how we plan to approach it.
Yes, indeed. Yes. So, Kate, would you say that Shadow of Night is your favorite book in the series? Where would you rank Shadow of Night out of the 3 books?
Shadow of Night is actually my least favorite book. So I would put Book of Life first, and then A Discovery of Witches, and then Shadow of Night. I know that many people have different opinions about that and rate Shadow of Night very, very highly. And what I will say for Shadow of Night for me is that the bright spots are incredibly bright. There are things I adore in this book, and that the dark spots are incredibly dark for me. So I find it on the whole, because I find it to be an uneven book, that is where I place it in my ranking. What about you?
Yeah, I also put it third. I put A Discovery of Witches first, and then Book of Life, and then Shadow of Night. And it's for a lot of the reasons you named, but of course that is just because it's not our first ranked book in the series like it is for a lot of people. It doesn't mean that we don't like it. It's still like our third ranked book in a series that we love very, very much.
So, right. Yes, that is fair to say.
Yes. So while we'll certainly have things to say with a capital T about a lot of stuff in Shadow of Night, there's a lot of like really amazing stuff in Shadow of Night also. So that I'm excited to talk about.
And I will reiterate that I think that when you boil Shadow of Night, when you boil the entire story down to its bones, from books 1 to book 3, I think that the story has incredible bones. The story is very, very good. But the Shadow of Night portion, to me, tends to be more uneven in tone and pacing than the other 2 books of the series. And I think that part of my issue with it, which of course we will discuss later in detail, is just that we lose so much momentum that I find it to meander a bit in places that I think it could have a bit more pep and a bit more go. But that doesn't mean that we don't get some really gorgeous vignettes. We get some of my favorite scenes, some of my favorite characters. So all in all, I'm very much looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And since we're talking about pacing a little bit and chapters, we've published our reading schedule for Shadow of Night. Some of you may notice that we are not keeping to the same 3-chapter episode structure that we kept for most of A Discovery of Witches. And that is just simply because, as Kate said, that chapters are really uneven in Shadow of Night. And doing 3 chapters at a time for every single part of this book would be just like unwieldy and impossible. We would never get any discussion finished ever. So sometimes we're talking about 1 chapter. Sometimes we're talking about 2. And that's just because they're really uneven chapters, and it made it difficult to break things down.
Well, they're not just uneven in terms of size, they're also not...
content.
Right. It's most of what we've tried to do for the chapter breakdown for Shadow of Night is actually a thematic break. And so hopefully within the subsections of chapters we've broken out and that are available on our website, we have done these in chunks that represent the completion of a mini arc or one particular story idea that is carried through sometimes 1, sometimes 3, sometimes as many as 4 chapters. And so that reading list breakdown will be on our website for your perusal as we go through. There's also a chance that, given our scheduling for Shadow of Night and the release of the television show, that we may take a break from the chapter breakdowns of Shadow of Night right after part 2, because part 2 will land us somewhere in the middle or the end of August, which leads us to All Souls Con and then the release of the television show. And we would like to be able to do some sort of TV show episode while that show is running for those 8 weeks that we'll get the 8 episodes. And so we think that we might put the chapter discussions on hold for that period, but more news to come as we know who will pick up the series and what will happen then.
Yeah, and it's convenient actually that Shadow of Night, unlike the other 2 books, is broken up into parts, which are kind of like mini stories within the big story. Each part is a different kind of like smaller story arc, so it's convenient for us that it's broken into parts, because then it makes a good pause for us. So anyway, shall we do a Kate chapter summary?
Yes, but one thing, and that's just one more disclaimer about middle books. So the middle book or the middle story in any trilogy is always difficult, either because a lot of trilogies begin because a creator has an idea and that idea turns out to be too long for one book, and so a publisher or a director might choose to break it into 3 parts. And so that is one reason that middle sometimes suffer, is that the middle of the story works best when there's strong tension on either end, and when you chop up those parts, you end up with a story that is a bit amorphous and doesn't feel like it has a beginning or an end. They can sag a little bit just because there isn't enough pressure from the central narrative conflict, and sometimes they can just feel like they're telling a very different story. And so to the extent that we have criticism of Shadow of Night, part of that is also in recognition of the fact that middle books of trilogies are hard. They are very, 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 very hard. And they are made harder, I think, when you try to do something as ambitious as this story is trying to do in the scope of one book.
Yeah. Yep. So, and you'll find that with middle books and middle movies and middle, the middles of stories everywhere are just, for example, if you try to watch the middle movie, if you try to watch Two Towers separate from the other 2 Lord of the Rings movies, it will be difficult. It's difficult when you watch it together with the other 2 or read it with the other 2. But yeah, it's just like, it's a weird thing. It's taking all the context out of the story almost. Yeah.
And middle segments tend to be a little bit grim just all the way through, especially in stories if you've raised the stakes sufficiently, as we have in this book, for the entire world in essence to be at stake, or like existence to be at stake, good and evil to be at stake, then basically by default, that middle bit has to be very dark and very grim in order to make it believable that the last battle or the last confrontation is coming in such a way that those stakes are actually meaningful.
Yeah, because as we talked about in our Discovery Witches wrap episode, when you're doing plot points, when you're doing key scenes and beats in a story, in our larger 3-book story, the middle end of the 3rd book essentially puts us into all of the dark moments for the characters, and we have to resolve those in the 3rd book, but it leaves us with just a lot of like really big unresolved stuff in the middle book, just purely based on the plot points that we have to cover with our story.
Speaking of plot points, are we ready to talk about the first 3 chapters of Shadow of Night?
Yes. Let's do it.
Ye old chapter summary begins as follows. We land in an undignified heap of witch and vampire in the Old Lodge in 1590. Diana has successfully carried us into the past, and Matthew has not encumbered her. We spend most of the first 3 chapters meeting the individual characters of the School of Night, to include Kit Marlowe, George Chapman, Tom Harriet, Henry Percy, and Walter Raleigh. Then we go through this entire procedure about whether to tell them the truth, which we in fact do. We tell them how Diana came to be with Matthew and how Diana and Matthew came to be in 1590. But of course, we stop before anyone can have the uncomfortable thought that this is not the same Matthew they've seen very recently. We meet Francoise and Pierre, the vampire servants of the de Clermont family who have come to England. And then in the end, Diana is measured for gloves. All of this takes place in a very short period of time, but honestly, with all the summary of A Discovery of Witches that we do in 3 chapters, it feels like forever.
Yeah, there is not a lot of new plot in the first 3 chapters. And one of the things that we do in this book that I'm just going to get out of the way now, we do it in this book and we do it in Book of Life, is something that writers do quite a lot in series, and that is spend a great deal of time talking about things that already happened in a previous book. And the difficulty with that is that it kind of caters to the lowest common denominator and does not allow for trust for the readers. The other thing it does, particularly in this case, is that it kind of breaks our suspension of disbelief for the story, right? Like, fiction requires a certain investment in the story, and you're in this world. And in The Discovery of Witches, we have this narrator who we assume to be Diana, and we have all of these characters. And when you do things like, for example, in the first chapter, she's talking about like, Matthew is a vampire, blah, 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 all the things that we already know. And when you put that in Diana's voice, you're essentially diminishing her credibility as a narrator, because you're like, if Diana's telling us this story and it's a continuous story, why is she coming back in and being like, by the way, Matthew's a vampire? I know I just spent an entire book talking about him. So but you find it all the time in series, and sometimes, particularly in these 3 chapters, it's layered on very thick, and it makes it kind of difficult to read, particularly since we have just finished A Discovery of Witches. So, yeah, and it's just kind of like a little bit of lack of confidence sometimes on the part of the author. And perhaps sometimes too, an editor might, make them insert these things because it's a series and because there might be quite a few years in between releases of the book, but it does a lot of discredit to the story overall.
I would agree with that and say that I wish what publishers and authors would do in cases like this, even if it is a couple years in between publication of books, is actually just do what they recently did for The World of All Souls and distill A Discovery of Witches, the plot, into basically 3 pages to put at the beginning to be like, just in case you didn't join us for our last episode, here is the plot of the book that already happened, and then move forward. And I think what's so striking about the way that it is done in the first 3 chapters of this book is the contrast between the utter and complete confidence of the first line of this book and the stuttering way in which we continue to tell the story. Like, the book literally opens with her saying, "We arrived in an undignified heap of witch and vampire." And we are dropped immediately into the plot we just left, which sort of intimates that we know what's happening, and then we do all this backtracking. And some of it, to be most generous to the narrator, I think that some of the clunkiness of these first 3 chapters, that is the excess of detail and sort of the distractedness, comes from the fact that Diana is completely overwhelmed at having successfully traveled to 1590. But it also feels like, tonally, it feels like such a different book. And I think that is a really chewy thing to talk about. And that is, are we shifting tones in the book because the story requires it? Or is it because the narrator is approaching it with a different frame of mind? Or are we just telling a different kind of story and we don't realize it yet?
Yeah. And I think at some points in the 3 chapters, there are times when this happens when it's certainly appropriate for it to happen, like when they're filling in the entire School of Night on, how they got there and why they're there. In those cases, it's appropriate. I mean, it's difficult and unwieldy plot-wise, but it's appropriate because they have met all of these new characters that they need to fill in on, what's going on. And that is an appropriate time. But sometimes when it's just dropped into the middle of a page and you're like, yeah, okay, fine. So,
it's a thing that happens.
Yeah.
It's a thing that happens.
It's just a thing that happens.
So here we are,
It's
undignified
okay.
heap. Ye old undignified heap.
Yeah.
Heapy?
Mm-hmm.
Eh?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ye oldie unwieldy heapy? That's
Ye
lots of
oldie.
E's.
Really, Shadow of Night is just an excuse for us to say words wrong.
Correct. To add unnecessary vowels whenever possible.
You're welcome, everybody. You're going to spend the next 6 months or so with us.
Everything will be ye oldie something. Just you wait. We're very clever.
Incessantly saying things incorrectly. This joke is never going to get old.
Well, probably not for us.
Yeah, so we have this lovely introduction to the lodge where we have been, but now we're kind of in its heyday at the Ye Olde Lodge. And she is describing the surroundings, and it all sounds very lovely and very homey.
It does. I was sort of tripped up on the very first page. So we are on page 3 of the mass market paperback, where she said, after journeying so far into Matthew's past, which snagged just because I think it is another thing to put in our sort of like little conversation box about what kind of a time travel story we're in, because it seems like it's referring to a specific kind of past as opposed to sort of a multifaceted or singular, you know what I'm trying to say, as opposed to a singular past. It sounds like we're going into a facet of a past.
Right. Alternately, we have Diana still excluding herself from her own story as a character.
That too.
Yeah. Yeah. She's like, we're in Matthew's past. I'm like, well, you're there too. I mean,
yeah. And the extent to which she either perceives herself to be or Matthew treats her as a passenger to this adventure, which they theoretically undertook together, is one of the most difficult parts, not only of the first 3 chapters, but of this entire book. Like the extent to which we ended our discussion of A Discovery of Witches talking about how Diana, because she's not fully in possession of her own identity, has sort of cleaved herself to Matthew. And it's almost, there are other places in this book where it is as evident, but the first 3 chapters are absolutely her in over her head and cleaving to Matthew, and Matthew being a bit much.
yeah. And I mean, at the end of Discovery of Witches, we have Matthew being the one whose idea it is to go to the past. And she acquiesces. And while she is the person, the only reason that they were able to go to the past, she is back to, she's kind of like, oh, I've done my part now. And I will sit back and try to be an Elizabethan now. So, yeah, she's back to being very much just like shell Diana. She's in a shell. She got her head in the sand again. She did a big thing, which was very admirable, and she spent a lot of the end of A Discovery of Witches like with a lot of trauma. And she did a lot of work, and now she feels like she's done. So,
or at least from the first 3 chapters of this book, you would believe that she thinks that that challenge is done, and now all she needs to learn how to do is write her name properly, so that future historians, i.e. future people like her, won't know the difference between her handwriting and anybody else's, which, again, we'll talk about it in a bit, but I happen to think a lot of that is just like the fresh trauma of, holy shit, I just traveled in time.
yes.
On
yes.
purpose.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting. And then she's having this kind of like weird, wobbly, understandably disoriented thing in the beginning of chapter 1. And then she says she's fine. And you're like, but you just said that you're not? Like, narrator, you just said that you're like feeling really weird. And then you're like, that's good. Everything is fine.
Well, I mean, maybe everything would be fine if Kit weren't there.
I would, before we get to Kit, really quickly, she has this lovely moment on page 4 where she says, for the first time in my life, I was absolutely delighted to be a witch. I'm like,
congratulations.
That's lovely. Yay. Hooray.
I'm glad that it brings her joy right before it brings her, crushing scrutiny.
Not joy. Yes. Yes. I just thought it was a lovely moment for her, for us beginning to kind of see where Diana will end up.
Why do you think? And so, plop, in the middle of page 4, we have our first, little mini antagonist in the form of Kit Marlowe. And I wonder, do you think that this is a thematic choice in terms of, giving Diana, just a rude awakening to the past? Is Kit a symbol of how little she actually knows, or how difficult it's going to be for Matthew to balance who he was with who he now is? Or what is Kit doing, and why do we get him so early?
Yes. I think it's a little bit of all of those things. In addition, I would say, and we can certainly put a pin in this for the end of the book, but just for me, Kit is the primary antagonist for this book. He's the one who pushes back against Diana and prevents Diana from doing things the most out of any other character in Shadow of Night. That, of course, doesn't make him, a primary protagonist for the series, but certainly in this book, he does quite a lot of protagonisming.
He protagonizes, or pardon me, he antagonizes.
Yes, sorry.
Greatly.
Thank you. Yeah, so, and I think he also serves as kind of, like you said, a reality check for Diana, not just about how much she doesn't know, but everybody that you've read about in the past isn't going to like you and want to be your friend, she feels like she knows all of these people. But they know nothing about her. And, they've never met. She knows all about them, but they don't know her. And certainly there's that aspect of, history leaves out quite a lot about people. So.
Yeah. Or that people are just people. Whenever you peel back the layers of the onion, famous people, talented people, important people were fundamentally people. And some of them were good people. Some of them were neutral people. Some of them are not very good people at all. And
some of them are Kit Marlowe.
And some of them are Kit Marlowe.
Would you say we're fans of Kit Marlowe?
I would say that I have a great deal of pity for Kit Marlowe as a character, but I also have a great deal of contempt. And the treatment we get from him on page 5, when he looks at Diana and says, "Wherever did you find that?" is, first of all, nigh unforgivable. But again, much like the association with Juliet in the last book, we are presented to Kit because he is a friend of Matthew's, right? The fact that he is so close to Matthew and that he was once Matthew's best friend tells us some things that we're not ready to talk about with respect to Matthew.
Mm-hmm. And we certainly, I feel like the book sometimes tries to put it all on Kit by saying, well, Kit was in love with Matthew and he's jealous, therefore he's going to be an awful human being for the entire book. But friendship goes both ways and requires two people to be friends, and Matthew was friends with Kit. So
reportedly very good friends with Kit and close to Kit, and they got into a great deal of hijinks together.
Yeah. And so Matthew gets 50% of the blame for this particular relationship.
Yeah, and that, I think, is extraordinarily difficult to walk into within the first 5 pages of the book, especially if you, as the reader, are coming in with Diana and you have this expectation of we're going on an Elizabethan romp, guys.
Yeah.
And then you realize that it's not all, history books and pretty roughs. There is a great deal of complication, and I'm not sure how much of that in this book is, at least in this first, well, I would say through most of the book, whether there's a good deal of historical social commentary there about how Diana doesn't realize how helpless she is until she, in this environment, until she begins realizing how constrained she actually is as an Elizabethan woman, which is what she purports to want to be.
Yeah. Yeah. We will struggle with Kit. We will forge on with Kit. The times he is absent are blessed, and the times he are there, the times he is there are fraught. So.
But at the same time, you know, like, while Matthew treats Kit with a good deal of scorn on pages 5 and 6 when Kit is rambling on about Diana being a whore, an exceptionally tall whore, as I understand it, it's not as though you can really fault Kit in the sense that he has no other information to go on. And, like, on the one hand, like, I'm glad that Matthew is offended on Diana's behalf, and on the other hand...
Yeah. Like, who
what else,
else is she supposed to be? I mean...
Yeah, until you give, you know, the truth in a chapter's time, you know, Kit has nothing else to go on, and he's just behaving apparently as it's been appropriate for him to behave in your house for some time.
Yeah, so you have no one to blame but yourself, Matthew. He's rifling through your mail. He's doing all kinds of things. Shall we take a break from Kit for a minute and meet Pierre and Francois?
Certainly we shall.
Yes, who I love. We have more vampire servants. Hey, I like Pierre and Francois a lot.
I do too. We have very, very loyal vampire servants that appear based on their familiarity with Matthew to have been with the de Clermont a long time. We also have, I think, in these 3 chapters, just a remarkable sense of change and tone shifting. The thing that is always interesting to me is to look at how quickly Matthew settles or adjusts or sort of like steps into this version of his life. He seems to act as though he's picking up right where he left off.
Yeah. To the extent that he shares that information with Diana is arguable. Whether he was prepared for all of this or whether he is just very adaptable is something that's kind of up for debate, I guess.
Or whether this version of Matthew was like not very far from the surface the whole time. You know, this version of Matthew, or that he's so eager to be back with these people and in this frame of his life that, I mean, really within the first 3 chapters, he feels different to everyone, including the reader and Diana. So I'd just sort of like to stick a pin in that. And then, you know, we've met Pierre and Francoise, who of course are like, yes, milord, like whatever you say about this strange naked woman in the house, we'll buy it. Okay. But then there's Diana, and she seems to say that on page 7, the witch within me had awakened during our journey to the past. There was no telling what other magic had been unleashed. And I sort of want to be like, well, that's because you just meaningfully used magic for one of the first times in your entire life.
Yeah.
What else did you expect?
For, like, not a small thing. So this is certainly not fixing the washer.
No. Not even in the same universe of activities as fixing the washer.
Yeah, so, and this comment from her is prompted by the fact that her hair grows, which I'm not sure what to make of the hair thing. I don't know what you think about it, but yeah, she's sort of acting like things would be the same after traveling this far into the past using magic.
Well, I mean, I think that it's interesting that she as a character makes the choice to try and link that back to her acting days. You know, when she was playing Ophelia and her hair started to grow uncontrollably, and perhaps like the combination of using the magic, actually like flexing those muscles, and then her internal desire to play a role, you know, to treat this as though it is a part she can play for a particular amount of time. I mean, I do actually agree with Matthew to some extent that she's placing too much emphasis on pretending to be something she's not. But I also think that he is discounting the danger of difference, which is just something that he, I don't think, really grasps from the perspective of his privilege in the first part of this book.
Right. Yeah. And that conversation in chapter 3, certainly maybe Matthew has more practice at adapting. And I buy the role-playing part from Diana. I'm not sure why it requires red hair, but I certainly understand the longer hair bit, and the fact that she is trying to fit in, and therefore, of course, the things that happened to her before when she was quote-unquote acting would happen to her now. I just don't know why her hair had to change color. Maybe that's what she imagined for herself as an Elizabethan woman. I don't know.
Or maybe she doesn't have great control over it, and her magic is just saying, and now you're a redhead.
Mm-hmm. Maybe she's not
I ginger you.
Maybe she's not a natural blonde.
Of all the things that we've discussed, we've not discussed whether Diana is a natural blonde.
I don't know. I feel like it might fit with her character to just try to like disguise and change as much of her witchy side as possible, and making herself a blonde instead of a redhead maybe was part of that. I don't know. That's all conjecture, you guys. I have no textual evidence whatsoever.
So, what do we think about the rapid introduction of the School of Night in Chapter 1?
Okay. Sometimes I like the School of Night. A lot of the time I do not. And it is because 5 new characters is a lot. And particularly when 2 out of the 5 are very well drawn, 3 out of the 5 are almost indistinguishable from each other in terms of just like voice and tone, and the manner in which they're written is very, very similar, and it's difficult as a reader to pick them out. Kit and Walter are the easiest to distinguish within the group. They're the most formed out of the 5 characters, and the other 3 I would almost want to smush together and just keep George and smush the other 2 and
See, I would keep Henry Percy because that's the only way that we get Mary
or was
Sidney
it Henry?
later
Am
on.
I confusing myself? No, yes, Henry. I would keep Henry. I would smush George and Tom into. See, I can't even keep their names straight. There are several chapters in this book when all 5 members and Matthew are present and they're all talking, and for the life of me, I cannot tell who is who. So, including their names, obviously. But yes, Henry, Lord Henry. I would keep him, and I would smush Tom and George into him. Yeah. It's just a lot. I mean, we meet all of these people in quick succession, and obviously, Diana is very disoriented by it, and certainly anybody would be very disoriented by it. I, as a reader, am very disoriented by it. But it's just a lot. What do you think?
I tend to agree with you, and I understand that once you've chosen the conceit of using Matthew Royden, who is a real historical person, as the alias for Matthew de Clermont in the past, that by sticking him in this seemingly convenient historical slot as a real person, that it feels like short shrift to excise the other members of the School of Night, and at the same time, in the name of historical accuracy and fictional success are not one and the same. And I do feel like this School of Night sometimes feels a bit cluttered, and that perhaps we have bitten off more than we can chew in terms of the number of characters we are expected to juggle in that first chapter, especially when so few of them end up exerting actual pressure on the plot or being people that we really truly need. Kit, Walter, and Hal also all do things in the book, whereas George and Tom are just sort of there to round out the set, not necessarily because they have a lot to say or do.
Yes. And I think you're certainly correct that one of the difficulties with historical fiction is we have this real person who was a member of the School of Night, and therefore, do we need the entire School of Night? Can we just reference them? I feel like you could just say they're out of the country, or yes, these are all of the members of the School of Night, but we don't have to meet them all. And you are correct. Tom and George don't do a lot. We really don't need them in terms of the plot. So
And that's a question that I think that we should ask ourselves and our readers to engage with a critical mindset. Critical, not necessarily negative, but critical in terms of thinking honestly about the kinds of narrative choices we're making. That when you choose to do historical fiction, that there are things, while I do think that this is a masterwork in terms of its accuracy, for real historical things and places and items and people, that does sometimes mean that things that might be better edited out or condensed or simplified are not done for the sake of accuracy when they don't earn their weight. Or they don't earn their space in the narrative. So that is all I will say about Tom and George for now. I do very much like the introduction that we get to Hal and to Walter.
Oh, I adore Hal, actually.
Yes. No, I think Hal is just magnificent. And in the audiobook, in my opinion, I love the way that Jennifer Ikeda voices him. And I especially love what we get in that. I think it's in the first chapter when Hal is toasting the bread and tells Walter to go back outside and start over.
Yeah.
Like, get a grip, come back.
Yeah. I like him a lot. And I do like Walter a lot. And, as we've talked about Kit already, he's really well drawn, and Walter is a really good and necessary balance for Kit when they are all together. And Hal is darling, and I like him a lot. Do we have anything else to say about chapter? Oh, so are we done with School of Night for now?
We are done. I apologize. I just noticed that conversation with Hal is in chapter 2, but I do have one or two things to say about chapter 1 before we move on. So go on.
I was just going to move on a little bit to the dressing scene, and I love Francois's discretion and the extent to which she can kind of like allow for the de Clermont family legacy and secrecy, and understand that like all these things have happened. I'm talking about the scar. It's on page 14 of chapter 1. And she can just like see it and understand what it means and move on with things, and in a fairly unjudgmental manner.
Certainly. I would like to raise a toast from here on out to any of the de Clermont family staff. Period, paragraph, end of story. Consummate professionals that they are. And I love her prescience, right? She, on page 15 at the top, when she says safe, do not think that you are safe here, madame. None of us are. I appreciate that she's inserting that at a moment where like Matthew and Diana are acting as though they've made this huge clever conquest and that they've actually successfully escaped their troubles and
are now safely on their Elizabethan vacation.
Right. And a thread that we should absolutely follow through the course of this book is what happens when you commit to a choice and to a plan that is maybe more risky than the thing you were eventually or originally trying to face. So I think that there is a sneaky way in which this book accomplishes one of the main goals of a central, the central portion of a trilogy in terms of things getting worse. And one of them is that things absolutely get more dire and they think that they've gone somewhere safe, but it's really not safe at all.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That was all I had to say about chapter 1. Do you have more about chapter 1?
Yes. I think that I just wanted to stick a pin in two things on page 16. One of them is Diana saying, here I had nothing to rely on but my own wits and Matthew. And just sticking that and sort of putting that on like the list of things to consider when we're talking about the development of her identity in this book. And that she still very much believes that she's reliant upon Matthew for these things. And as it turns out, if her wits are going to continue to be distracted by like, what is the name of the thing you are putting on my bum to keep my skirts away, then her wits are overwhelmed at the moment.
Which, by the way, I find it very difficult to believe that a historian would not know what a bum roll is.
Well, she was totally into magic. She was not into fashion.
Yeah, but I feel like there's just some like rote things that you would learn, particularly since she studies specifically alchemy, which is very prevalent during this time period. I feel like there are just other things that she would have just picked up as a historian, especially like.
Look, I'm gonna cut her a little bit of slack because I feel like she could tell you any kind of Elizabethan lab equipment, but she probably can't tell you anything about how many stays are in a corset.
Okay.
The only other thing that I wanted to stick a pin in on page 16 is Matthew attempting to state the 2 reasons why they're in the past, both of which I think are bigger than either of these characters are giving them credit for.
The 2 things being...
Find a teacher, find the manuscript.
Yeah, just 2 simple things.
Because it's one thing, I mean,
we'll be in and out in a week.
Civil War, it'll be over by Christmas. So, just the scope of those 2 goals alone, and Matthew just sort of blithely being like, well, we'll find a teacher. He doesn't seem to allow for any time for the teaching of the magic.
Right.
And then we'll find the manuscript, which potentially was presumably, if not already lost, then like heavily guarded and still a secret in 1590, or he certainly might have heard about it the first time he was there. So I just thought it was fascinating that he's blithely like, yes, these are the 2 things we'll do, and then we'll go home. Very simple.
Right. The 2 things, which are actually 3 things, if we include the actual teaching of the magic, which seems like a key element to this plan.
No, it's just a quick pop to 1590. We'll be back. It's fine.
I really want to go back to the bum roll for a second, but I'm not going to.
You can.
I'm just saying, she knows what a farthingale is, but she doesn't know what a bum roll is. That's my problem.
Maybe she assumed that it was only a farthingale. Maybe she assumed that only you didn't use bum rolls, and maybe she's only acquainted with formal dress.
That's my main problem. It's not just that like she doesn't know about Elizabethan fashion because it's not her area of expertise, but she does know about Elizabethan fashion. Just some of it. That was all. It's like butter, you guys. I can't let it go.
Okay. Of bum rolls and butter. The Jen story.
Anyway, let's move on to chapter 2, shall we?
Let's officially meet Hal on page 19 when he is waiting for them in the kitchen and has so graciously waited to be invited by the lady of the house to stay. I have a heart drawn in the margins because I love him so much.
He's a darling. And I also, in this same area, in chapter 1 and 2, it happens. I love the beard joke, you guys. I love the beard joke so much. It makes me really happy that every member of the household and the School of Night comes in and immediately asks Matthew why he doesn't have a beard. It pleases me very much. For no reason.
I'm glad. Because for me, I just pity Diana that she can't make her husband a beard, if that's what witches are supposed to do in this time period. I'm just very sorry that, like, she can definitely take them on a road trip to 1590, but she can't, like, satisfy her husband's grooming needs.
Yeah, I think it's a lovely bit, and I adore it a lot.
Are you ill?
Anyway, we meet Matthew, where's your beard? And I enjoy Walter's introduction and Hal, like you said, Hal is and they're all sitting there around the table eating, and Walter comes in and immediately, has the whore jokes again.
Just steps in it.
Big time. And Hal's like, now be good and leave and come back and be polite.
What do we think of Kit on page 23 bringing up Odysseus and Circe?
That he's the worst, but also... would you like to give the gentle readers and listeners a brief history of Odysseus and Circe?
Certainly, I can. So if you read the Odyssey, there is the story overall tells the epic overall tells the story of Odysseus, who is returning home from the war, and he takes this long circumnavigation to get back to his home and to his wife Penelope. And so he is joined by a number of sailors. He has an entire crew. He is on a boat. For lack of detail, this is just an overview. What happens is that Odysseus is variously helped and plagued by a succession of gods and monsters on his way home to Penelope to reclaim his rightful throne and his marriage. And at one point, he opens a bag of the winds that takes him to an island, Aea, where is the home of the beautiful witch goddess Circe. And what Circe does is she drugs Odysseus's men and turns them into pigs. Odysseus has to go and rescue them, but in the meantime, Circe has fallen in love with him and wants to keep him with her forever. And so she keeps trying to drug and lure him and keep him from rescuing his men and continuing his quest. And so it is only with the assistance of Hermes, the Greek version of Mercury, that Odysseus is allowed to escape Circe's island and can see her for what she is, which is essentially a terrible, terrible, disastrous witch and a distraction. And so when Kit brings up the idea of Odysseus and Circe, it is not just insulting. It is infuriating, because I think, first of all, he wants the reference to go over Diana's head, which I don't know, it's not clear from the text whether it does or does not, but he's essentially implying, 1, that she has ensnared Matthew, 2, that she is evil, 3, that
he's Hermes.
Right, maybe. 3, that, like, Matthew needs rescuing, and 4, that she's going to turn them all into literal or figurative pigs.
Well, he's already a pig, so a figurative one. And that he's charged with rescuing. What I mean by, he's Hermes in the story is like he's charged with rescuing Matthew from this.
And of making him immune to Circe, which is like, I wouldn't say it's the first indication we have that Kit is going to try and cause trouble in Matthew and Diana's marriage, but certainly that he believes himself to be justified in doing so because he believes her to be fundamentally evil.
Kit, he's such a charming gentleman, isn't he?
He's also really dramatic, guys.
Yeah,
why do we have to
queen.
bring Odysseus into this at all?
Because he's a drama mama. But then, page 24, I was already heartily sick of Christopher Marlowe. Quoth Diana, us too.
Us too.
And I love how she's like, I thought we were going to be best buds, and now we're not.
Well, we also see, I think, in this chapter, more of Matthew's classic arrogance, in the sense that he believes he has everything under control. And this entire scene that we have in chapter 2, where he decides to tell them the truth about who Diana is and where she came from, or where they both came from. I think it's interesting that even Diana can see that it was more difficult for him to convince Walter and the others that he had made the right decision than she expected. And I don't know whether that's because they are more in line with the Matthew that is somehow absent, basically shut out in the cold of time, or if it's because Matthew really is being unreasonable, or is it because of their own prejudices of their time? One way or the other, I think that the tension in that scene is really well drawn.
You're talking about the one where all of the School of Night members are there, and Matthew tells them all. Yes, that scene?
Yes.
Okay.
The scene that begins on page 25, when essentially she says that she's from, that they say she's from the New World to come. And we have some really sharp and really well done dialogue in this scene, which is one of my favorite things from this chapter. For instance, page 25, where Diana tries to plea to Kit to try and make him like her better, to say, I wanted to be something different than who I was raised to be. And he says, ignorance is an unforgivable sin. And Walter comes back with, so is disloyalty. And just like, it's really tight dialogue. And I think that when we are not futzing about with historical detail, and when we're actually doing character, we do a very good job.
Yeah. Between Kit and Walter, I think. I think the dialogue between Kit and Walter is always excellent. In this scene, it's definitely excellent. But at the same time, on the same page, we have, the reference to quote unquote Harriet putting a hand on her shoulder. And I'm like, who is Harriet? Who is this person? And I have to flip back and be like, oh, oh. I'm like, is this a typo? What are we doing here? So I think the dialogue with Matthew and Kit and Walter is really, really excellent. But again, with so many characters, some of them being not as well drawn or introduced. I mean, Walter Raleigh, like, we know who he is. Kit Marlowe, we know historically who he is, right? We know who Matthew is just by virtue of these books. These other characters, in terms of history and what you learn from history, are minor, if not absent, to most people. So, which makes it really difficult to come in and just like call them by their last name and expect that we're going to know who they are, after only just being introduced to them in the previous chapter. Yes. So that part for me makes the scene difficult and really muddy. But I agree with you that a lot of the dialogue is really excellent.
I would say that it comes in and out of focus. And I guess my point there is to say that I think that we do our best when we are just doing character and when we are balancing the personalities in the room and saying the things we need to say to get the truth out. And we're not either explaining something either to the humans in the room or to the readers, and when we're not recapping.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I just really love Sir Walter's attitude toward Kit, like, a lot. And he has all of those comments on page 24, I think, about how, like, Kit owes everything to Matthew. And it's prior to his comment about disloyalty being, it's on the prior page, I think. And yeah, I just really love it a lot. That he's not taking any of Kit's BS.
Certainly. And I love how while Walter is critical of Matthew and stands up to Matthew, which Matthew desperately needs in general, but specifically needs, I think, with respect to how he plans to manage the congregation and how he plans to manage this plan. I appreciate that he also sees everything that Matthew has done for everyone else in that room. And when Kit says, oh, he asks too much, Walter goes, it's too little and it's late. For everything that he has done for us, we can do this thing for him and we will do this thing for him. And is the other strong voice that brings the rest of the School of Night to heel. Although I think Hal would have done whatever he could anyway because he's a sweetheart.
Oh, certainly. Yeah. And we do get on page 26 this interesting tidbit that kind of feeds into like our broader history of Matthew, which is Kit saying, where they're talking about the book and why they're there, and Kit saying, you've never been interested in the quote unquote the book of mysteries, so like on creature history, like you have never been interested in myths and fables. So the 1500s version of Matthew was not interested in creature origins. He was doing other things.
Right, apparently just hanging out with an insufferable prat.
and other things that we'll get to in chapter 4, but
And that's consistent with what Matthew says in A Discovery of Witches, which is to say that he started looking into the book in 1859, that he became fascinated as a result of Darwin, that he goes back and looks for this book, which is why, in some senses, understanding that the universe was conspiring to bring them to 1590, but it certainly does make it look like a wiser choice to go back farther beyond his original interest in the book to find its origins or perhaps track it down unscathed.
And then at the end of the chapter, we get the Shakespeare quote about the School of Night, which is nice. I wonder, and maybe the Book of All Souls actually answers this question, but I don't know. But as a reader, without the extra textual information, I wonder if having the School of Night and using Matthew Royden as a character was so that we could use this quote from Shakespeare. Because sometimes writers do think where you just love something so much that you will do anything to include it in your story. Yeah. It's kind of a chicken and egg,
Right. I was actually going to point out page 29, where I think that we should put this in the basket of, like, what is going on with Diana? How is she changing? This idea that she can start to see weaves of color, and that she can see time, or that she has this feeling of past, present, and future meeting. And I think that it's interesting, the combination of sensations that brings it back to her. The rosemary, the lavender, the bells, of her being sort of having this moment where she is between, and where the idea of time is fluid as opposed to fixed, where she can be emotionally and spiritually in two places at once, even though she's in the past present or present past with Matthew.
Yeah.
So I think we should stick a pin in that.
Certainly.
And, and as for the insertion of the Shakespeare quote, I think that there is an extent to which this conceit of having Matthew be Matthew Royden in the School of Night exerts some of it is helpful pressure, and some of it is not so helpful pressure on the plot. But perhaps the symbolism of it here is that Diana is reckoning with her own potentially romantic ideas about who these people were, like we talked about a little bit ago, that, you can think you understand historical people and what they were like, and based on what was written about them, that's the best measure we have, but that's maybe not the most fair or accurate or true portrayal of who they were, the kinds of people that they were.
And before we leave this chapter, since we're talking about Shakespeare, I do love the joke about Shakespeare and of how, like, of course he's not here. And I the only problem I have with this, I wonder if it is historian Deb making a joke about Shakespeare, like haha wink history joke about Shakespeare, because it's Matthew saying it. Like, I wonder if it's just Diana's interpretation of it, like everything we get about Shakespeare being kind of like a mimic, and of course he's not in the School of Night, like all the other members disapprove of him. So yeah, I don't know, we can keep track of Shakespeare as we go through, just to entertain me.
Certainly. In chapter 3, we do some interesting things vis-a-vis the time travel that I just wanted to touch on very quickly. I'm sorry. We do get a bookie. We get a bookie that we're very concerned about because it might be left for other people to look at later on, and it might be inconsistent. But I appreciate Matthew having, in kind of an uncharacteristic Matthew fashion, I might have to turn this one over in my brain for a little bit, but Matthew being simultaneously like super controlling and like super laissez-faire, where he's like, let history take care of itself.
So I have a note about that as well. Yes,
that's on page 33,
where he says the book won't leave the house, and she's like, you can't possibly know that, and he's like, let history take care of itself. So I wonder if it is him being very nonchalant about this, or if he has made plans that he hasn't told Diana about, like with his family, that we'll get to talk about a little bit when we get to the end of this section, and we'll certainly have to keep track of all of these goings on about what Matthew knew and when he knew it and what plans he made before they left.
Right, for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Matthew de Clermont has not lived to be a 1600-year-old vampire for naught.
And it feels very nonchalant of him to be like, meh, it's fine, use whatever name you want, it doesn't matter.
But then again, I mean, if we think back to the end of A Discovery of Witches, and the portion of A Discovery of Witches that I actually consider to be the first part of Shadow of Night, when that chess piece comes back to him in North Carolina, like basically he's already been bitten in the behind by the past. so hard that perhaps he is more willing to let history take its course, especially after he goes through, as he says on page 34, the same chess game with Kit, and where Kit still wins it fair and square, and Matthew just comes to that point of being like, I have to trust that this is going to turn out the way it's supposed to, because there's no other way to look at it at this point. Like, somehow that chess piece that I know that I lost, and I now lost twice, will hopefully end up in the same place twice, if that is necessary for the future to turn out the way that it did. Which, I guess my point is, I'm just glad that they don't spend the first, or at least Matthew is a voice pushing back on the idea of worrying too hard about what happens in the future, because there are other time travel stories where the concern about what will influence the future is overbearing and difficult.
Yes. Other time travel stories that we will not talk about. I will say this bit with the chess piece, since we're keeping track of our time travel discussion in this book, goes into the stable time loop basket, and is part of my stable time loop argument, this bit with the chess piece. So we will put a pin in that. And then we have lots of stuff about clothes and shoes and such like, and the bookie.
Yeah, and sometimes when I read the bit about the shoes and the gloves, I feel a bit like it seems silly, and yet I think that one of the things that portion of the plot is doing is telling us, well, there are different kinds of danger in this plot and in this time than Diana is used to dealing with, and she does not seem to understand the extent to which her continued safety is dependent upon Matthew's protection, not just because she's his wife, but also because she's a witch in a difficult time, and that she is a stranger, and how it's not just about buying a pair of shoes or buying a pair of gloves. It is about introducing people who have never seen her before to her when she is not prepared to receive, shall we say.
Yeah, I feel like Diana, the character of Diana, wiffle waffles with that a lot. Because in this chapter, she is both terribly nonchalant and seemingly like ignorant about the danger, but at the same time she's like, no, I have to be like this thing, and like nobody can recognize me, and I have to blend in. And so she does seem to understand it, while at the same time not understanding it. And at the same time, you want to just be like, Matthew, the woman needs clothes, like, give it a rest.
Yes, Matthew honestly should have seen to the clothes and shoes earlier somehow. That is a reasonable thing to expect him to do. But I do think that as we will see later in this book, both of these characters are extraordinarily overwhelmed by being in the past. Matthew, on second thought, because it's not as he remembers it, or he doesn't remember it as well as he thought he did. Either of those are possible. And for her, because it's not as she imagined.
And we get a bit of this, like, in chapter 3, what I would like to call the catch-up with Diana, even though it's only been 2 days, but she makes it seem like we got in a discovery, which is where she makes only a couple of days seem like a very long time. She's like, sometime later, this and this and this and this and this happened, but it's only actually been 2 days. According to the dates in her bookie, it's only been 2 days. And I think a little bit, yes, they're both overwhelmed. We are also getting from Matthew, he's sinking into this past version of himself and kind of he's assuming things will take care of themselves when they certainly will not. And he's kind of leaving Diana behind and getting embroiled in all of this stuff, and he's losing track of the ball. A lot.
Yeah. But we do get, on page 40 at least, that glimpse into him and into the grief of centuries spent without people that you truly loved. Because I don't doubt for a minute, based on even the first 3 chapters of this book, that this was one of the happiest, most fruitful periods of Matthew's life because he had these friends, and that he's been exceptionally lonely without them. And so he can be, to some extent, forgiven, although he annoys the bejesus out of me at certain parts in this book, and certainly certain parts in these 3 chapters. He can be forgiven to some extent for his willingness to be distracted by them, or just through the joy of seeing them again. And we get that from his first interaction with just smelling Marlowe in the house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And several things. One, we have the quote on page 40 about vampires can't brood over those we leave behind, except you, Matthew, who
brood about everything.
Yes, you brood about everything. You do a considerable amount of brooding.
I really do just think that is him stating something that may not be personally true, because we are not,
because he's been asked the question,
right? Yeah. We're not often the best at talking about how we actually feel about things, so he can't be either.
Right. Yeah. Other vampires can't brood about those that they have left behind. Matthew seems to like to do it a lot. And the other thing I think we're getting is like Matthew and Diana, because of the newness of their relationship, because of this overwhelming circumstance, we get them as a couple not communicating and demonstrating that they both have separate goals and separate means of attaining those goals, and each person is assuming that the other person is on board with what's going on, but they really just need to sit down in a room without distractions and have a check-in and a conversation about the things that they need to do.
Yeah, and so much of Shadow of Night, and so much of the discussion we'll have about the plot of Shadow of Night, is about like Diana and Matthew. Well, I think there's an argument that we spend a lot of this book trying to like talk about and go through Matthew's trauma, but then also teaching them how to be together, like how to look each other in the eye and actually make decisions together about what will happen. And that's a long road. It's a hard road.
Because they're quite frequently in this book at cross purposes, but they assume that they're both on the same path.
Right.
Yeah. But then you also have, on the same page, Diana making moon eyes about how much she's falling in love with Matthew all over again with this past Matthew. And you're like, but there's a lot of relationship work you need to do.
Right. You have not arrived, my dear. Yeah. You have not.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to put another pin in page 42 when Diana begins to see colors around people, and then her first actual discussion about how she thought about time and then how she found time. And just as a potential counterpoint to the stable time loop theory, or at least as a nuance to add to it, the quote on page 42, "I'd thought of time as a substance made of threads of light and color. With enough concentration, you could focus on a single thread and follow it to its source. Now, after walking through several centuries, I knew that apparent simplicity masked the knots of possibility that tied an unimaginable number of pasts to a million presents and untold potential futures."
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So,
which goes into our multiverse basket. Right? In terms of time and time travel, since we're keeping track of all of those things. Yes.
Because if we are in a multiverse, then I don't know. Well, I mean, obviously Matthew doesn't have the present-mindedness of and the understanding of time travel that we theoretically as readers do. But then how can he be so sure that the chess piece will go to the same place?
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Or maybe his point is the more simple one of, like, if you worry so much about what's going to happen in the future, you'll be paralyzed in the present, and that's just impossible. You can't worry about it.
So we have those two baskets, and then we also have all of those things fit into the Magicverse basket together. So
we end the chapter with the two of them rather at cross purposes, like it's sort of setting the tone of their relationship for this novel, which is that Matthew is dismissing some of Diana's like very reasonable concerns. Thank goodness Diana is having some concerns about things that might happen to her. Like she's actually thinking about potential consequences, and she's saying, hey Bubba, like this could go very, very badly. Or like, you know, on the one hand, it makes it more reasonable that she's thinking about how well she'll blend in, because she realizes that if she is bringing, say, a marginalized person, another witch, into the situation, like if she is a stranger, then she is a threat to them as well. And Matthew just sort of dismisses it, and we end the chapter on this note of secrecy, because she's not telling him how much more, even in the last 24 hours, she is seeing. With her magic sort of like, oh, you rang?
Yeah. And we get Matthew, like we talked about, kind of like some of Matthew's worst characteristics is him just forging ahead without thinking about things very much. And both, well, not as much Diana, but Matthew being certainly very, very reactive instead of proactive. Like now that he smells her magic has changed, and now he's like, oh yeah, that witch that we're supposed to find, we should probably do that. It's probably a good idea.
Do we think that Matthew is being necessarily reactive, or do we think that he's just so immersed in his prior life, and then he's so distracted that he's not being proactive about the things he should be proactive about?
I think it's both. I think it's his character weaknesses and the distraction causing him to be reactive, right? Like he's falling back into his like very much comfort zone, and he's super distracted by all of his friends and being back in the past, that now he's like lost track of what's supposed to be going on. And despite Diana kind of like poking him continuously, and the other members of the School of Night poking him about let's get things going, he's decided to be reactive about it instead of taking care of it. Not to mention, like, none of them has any idea how to find a witch.
Right. No one has any idea how to do that thing. Yeah.
And we're going to see how that ends out.
I think it is a worthwhile thing to add to our upcoming discussions of the School of Night and of Shadow of Night, of how much, we've had some conversations in different books about like what eras were particularly good for particular vampires, and how vampires are sort of a product of the age that they were raised in. And it seems, even from the first 3 chapters of Shadow of Night, that perhaps Elizabethan England was a place where Matthew was very happy, but it also appears to be a place where he was not challenged to be better. It seems like many of the proclivities of this...
He was allowed to be a playboy.
Many of the proclivities of the School of Night reinforce some of his worst qualities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Playboy Matthew. And the group of playboys.
Right.
Except for Hal, who's certainly not a playboy.
Sweet Hal. Best
school
Hal.
marm. Hal.
Favorite Hal. George is the school marm.
Oh, see, this is what you're talking about. I feel like Hal is also the school marm.
All right, Clovers, you're going to have to keep track of every time that Jen can't figure out who's who in the School of Night.
Yeah. Before we close our discussion in chapter 3, I can leave the bum roll and the farthingale behind, but I have a really, really much harder time believing that Diana doesn't know what a commonplace book is. Being a historian who has spent quite a lot of times in libraries reading things that people in the past have written. Like, at the very least, she knows what that is. And Matthew mansplaining it to her and telling her, it's like a laptop. And I'm like, schmack, schmack. Matthew. Anyway.
You're a woman of letters. You must have somewhere to put them.
It's a diary. Matthew, it's a diary. She knows what a diary is.
Only this one did not come with a padlock.
A little cute little heart-shaped lock. And Diana certainly knows what, like, she knows what a commonplace book is, guys. Like, she may not know what a bum roll is, but she knows what this thing is. Anyway, that's chapter 1, 2, and 3, guys. I feel like we should end it on a positive.
Okay, what is your favorite thing about the first 3 chapters of Shadow of Night?
I enjoyed, there's a lot of humor that's very subtle in chapters 1, 2, and 3, and I enjoy it a lot. And I enjoy Hal a lot because he's a teddy bear.
Yeah, Hal is my favorite part of the Hal is my favorite part of the first 3 chapters of Shadow of Night, bar none. He just, he makes it all okay. He is my safe place. Because I, as a reader, am a bit unsettled by the difference in tone, by like the sharp change between the end of Discovery of Witches and the feeling of the first 3 chapters of this book, and Hal always makes me feel like safely anchored.
Yeah. Hal is a delight. He will continue to be. And I think Deb just like does humor really, really well.
Yeah, she does.
And really, really
Yes,
subtly.
She does. When she allows it to be funny, it can be very, very funny indeed.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we look forward to hearing your thoughts on the first 3 chapters of Shadow of Night. You know where to get in touch with us. You can find us on Twitter at Chamomile N as a November Clove. You can find us on Gmail at chamomileandclovecast@gmail.com, or chamomileandclovecast.wordpress.com is our website.
Yes, and you can find us on Facebook, Chamomile and Clove Cast for the podcast, and the Chamomile and Clove Clovers for our group discussion. We haven't started any Shadow of Night discussion yet, but we will certainly be putting some tidbits and polls and bits of discussion on our Clovers Facebook page. And next time, we will be talking about chapters 4 and 5. So just 2 chapters. We're going to have a witch trial, you guys. As predicted.
So if you have thoughts, feelings, comments, or contributions, please feel free to get in touch with us at any of our available media. And we look forward to seeing you next time for chapters 4 and 5 of Shadow of Night.
We do. Thank you for listening.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.